Pacific Ocean. Early morning. Late May 1942. The air smells of fuel and salt. Engines cough to life one by one, their vibration rolling across the steel deck. Pilots move with quiet urgency. Time is measured in minutes now. Somewhere below, a young American sailor realizes he is late. His assigned aircraft is already gone. The ship he was meant to fly from is pulling away into the haze. There are no second chances at sea. No explanations. Only consequences. Instead, he is redirected. A different aircraft. A different launch point. A decision made without ceremony. High above the Pacific, Japanese warships move in formation, confident, disciplined, unaware. Their decks are crowded. Their defenses prepared for threats they expect, not the ones arriving by accident. Within hours, four ships will burn. Hundreds of sailors will not return. And a single misstep will echo across the war. This is not a story of destiny. It is a story of timing. And how war rewards no one, it only records what happens. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific War had entered a dangerous rhythm. Japan had struck first. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, had shattered any illusion of distance or safety. In 6 months, Japanese forces surged across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies and key island chains. Their navy moved with confidence born of preparation and early success. At the center of Japanese power stood the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was built for decisive battle. Carrier aviation, fast surface fleets, disciplined crews, and a doctrine that emphasized striking hard before the enemy could recover. The United States Navy, by contrast, was still reeling. Battleships lay wrecked in Pearl Harbor. Experienced pilots were scarce. Doctrine was being rewritten in real time. Yet something had changed. American aircraft carriers had survived the attack. Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, Hornet, Yorktown. They became the spear point of a new kind of war, one where aircraft, not guns, decided outcomes hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. In early May 1942, that reality revealed itself at the Battle of the Coral Sea. For the first time in history, opposing fleets fought without ever seeing one another. Aircraft did all the killing. The battle ended tactically indecisive, but strategically vital. Japan lost a carrier. Another was damaged. Most importantly, Japanese expansion was slowed. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval strategy, Coral Sea was a warning. For the Americans, it was proof that the enemy could be hurt. What followed was a gamble. Japanese intelligence believed the U.S. carrier force was weakened and demoralized. Yamamoto devised an operation to draw the remaining American carriers into a trap. The target was Midway Atoll, a small, isolated base northwest of Hawaii, but one with enormous strategic value. Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter. It would force the U.S. Navy into a decisive confrontation. And it would finish what Pearl Harbor had started. Operation MI was vast in scale and complexity. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, an invasion force. Against them, the Americans could muster only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, hastily repaired after Coral Sea. On paper, the balance was clear. But paper does not account for broken routines, or human error, or missed connections. As the Japanese fleet moved eastward in late May 1942, American cryptanalysts had already pierced its intentions. Codebreakers at Station HYPO, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, confirmed Midway was the target. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz committed everything he had. Carriers were rushed into position. Pilots flew with minimal training. Aircrews were reshuffled. Assignments changed by the hour. In this environment, precision mattered. Timing mattered. And absence mattered. Naval aviation in 1942 was unforgiving. A carrier deck was a machine that tolerated no delays. Aircraft were launched in tightly choreographed sequences. Miss your takeoff window and you were not simply late, you were erased from the plan. That is where this story begins to narrow. Among the thousands of men moving across steel decks and island airstrips was one young sailor, trained, capable, and entirely replaceable. His role was modest in the grand design of war. A pilot. Or a gunner. Or a crewman whose name would not appear in headlines. He was assigned to a specific aircraft. On a specific carrier. At a specific time. But war does not wait for individuals. A delayed briefing. The wrong turn. A moment too long. When the launch cycle began, his aircraft was already warming up without him. Officers could not afford to pause. Another man took the slot. The deck officer waved the plane forward. The aircraft roared into the sky. And the sailor was left standing on the deck. At sea, being late does not mean staying behind. It means being reassigned, immediately. That single administrative decision would place him somewhere he was never meant to be, on a flight path that no planner had intended. As Japanese carriers closed on Midway, and American squadrons prepared for a desperate counterstrike, chance quietly entered the operation. In the next section we follow the ship he missed, and the aircraft he would fly instead, as the stage for catastrophe fully takes shape. The aircraft carrier he was supposed to be on was already committed to its role. Deck crews moved with rehearsed efficiency. Bombs were locked into place. Fuel hoses were disconnected. Signal flags dropped. Once a carrier began its launch cycle, there was no flexibility. Every aircraft had a position. Every pilot had a slot in the formation. Miss it and the system corrected itself without hesitation. The sailor's name was crossed off one manifest and written onto another. He was sent not to the carrier he had trained with, but to a different unit, one operating under a looser structure, flying from a separate deck, tasked with a secondary mission that morning. It was not where the planners expected decisive action. It was a contingency force. This mattered. American carrier doctrine in 1942 was still evolving. Unlike the Japanese, who emphasized tightly coordinated strike waves, U.S. carriers often launched squadrons independently. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters sometimes arrived over targets separately, at different altitudes with little mutual support. It was a flaw. But it also created unpredictability. The sailor now found himself assigned to an aircraft that would take off later than the main strike groups. The delay was not intentional. It was procedural, the result of reshuffling crews and balancing aircraft availability. He climbed aboard an aircraft that was older, slower, and already considered vulnerable. The plane lacked armor. Its fuel tanks were unprotected. Survival depended on altitude, surprise, and luck. The mission briefing was brief and grim. Japanese carriers were believed to be northwest of Midway. Enemy fighter cover would be intense. Losses were expected. There was no mention of glory. Only objectives. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, American aircraft began lifting off from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Torpedo squadrons flew low over the ocean, slow and exposed. Dive bombers climbed high, searching for the enemy across a vast, empty sea. The sailors' aircraft launched later. This single fact would shape everything that followed. While the main American strike groups flew ahead, Japanese carriers were already reacting. Their combat air patrols engaged the first waves. Japanese Zero fighters descended on U.S. torpedo planes with devastating effect. Squadron after squadron was torn apart. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was virtually annihilated. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise suffered crippling losses. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown fared little better. They achieved almost nothing tactically. But they forced the Japanese fleet into constant maneuver. And they pulled Japanese fighters down to low altitude. Above them, the sky briefly emptied. It was into this moment, unplanned, uncoordinated, and largely accidental, that the sailor's aircraft arrived. Because he had launched late, his plane approached the enemy from a different direction. Because he was not part of the original strike, he was not expected. Because Japanese fighters were occupied below, the airspace above the carriers was thinly defended. The Japanese carriers were in the middle of rearming operations. This detail is critical. Below deck, hangar crews were moving aircraft, fuel lines, bombs, and torpedoes in preparation for another strike, either against Midway again or against the American fleet now known to be nearby. Safety procedures were compromised by urgency. Munitions were stacked. Fuel vapors filled enclosed spaces. Carrier doctrine assumed protection by fighter cover. That assumption had briefly failed. From altitude, American dive bombers began to spot the enemy. One by one they rolled into their attack dives. The sailor's aircraft was not leading. It was not central. It was simply present, at the right height at the right moment. When bombs fell, they did not merely strike steel decks. They pierced through to hangars packed with fueled aircraft and armed ordnance. Fire spread instantly. Explosions chained into explosions. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally wounded. A fourth carrier, Hiryu, would counterattack and briefly damage Yorktown, but it too would be found and destroyed later that day. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the core of Japan's naval air power, were lost. The sailor had not planned this. He had not anticipated it. He had simply been present because he was late. As smoke rose from the Pacific and burning ships slowed to a halt, the balance of the war shifted, not through flawless design, but through a convergence of sacrifice, chance, and imperfect systems. What followed next would define the moment when the Pacific War turned irrevocably against Japan. If this kind of deeply researched, cinematic World War II storytelling matters to you, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. It helps ensure these stories continue to be told. The decisive hours were not over yet. June 4, 1942, the hour that changed the war. The moment arrived without warning. At approximately 10:20 a.m., the Pacific below the American aircraft looked calm, almost indifferent. Scattered clouds drifted at altitude. The Japanese fleet moved in disciplined formation, its carriers carving white wakes through the water. From above, the view was unmistakable. For carriers, perfect alignment. Vulnerable. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had finally found their target after hours of searching empty ocean. Fuel was running low. Some crews were already considering turning back. Then the carriers appeared. Altitude mattered now. The aircraft rolled into their dives from more than 15,000 feet. Engines screamed as gravity pulled them downward. The wind tore at control surfaces. Pilots fought to keep their sights steady as the target rushed up to meet them. On the Japanese carriers, the timing could not have been worse. Below deck, hangar crews were in the middle of rearming operations. Aircraft were being refueled. Bombs and torpedoes were laid out in rows, not yet secured. Fire suppression systems were limited. Damage control doctrine assumed attacks would come in waves, not all at once. Japanese combat air patrol fighters were at low altitude, engaged with surviving American torpedo planes. Few were positioned high enough to intercept what was about to happen. The sailors' aircraft followed the dive, one among many, not a leader, not a commander, just part of the descent. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the carriers below. Black bursts filled the sky. Shrapnel ripped through wings and fuselages. Some planes were hit before releasing their bombs. Others pushed through, steadying their aim at the last possible second. Bombs fell. On Kaga, multiple hits tore through the flight deck and detonated inside the hangar. Fueled aircraft exploded instantly. Fire spread faster than crews could react. On Akagi, a single devastating hit struck near the midship elevator, igniting stored munitions and fuel. The blast traveled through enclosed spaces, trapping damage control teams and disabling command centers. On Soryu, bombs penetrated deep into the ship, setting off secondary explosions that made recovery impossible within minutes. The sea around the carriers filled with debris, smoke, and flame. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were transformed from operational warships into burning wrecks. The scale of destruction stunned both sides. American pilots pulled out of their dives and climbed away through smoke columns that reached thousands of feet into the sky. Some aircraft were damaged. Others were barely holding together. Many crews were already counting fuel and plotting desperate routes home. Below, Japanese sailors fought fires that could not be contained. Steel warped. Elevators jammed. Aircraft slid across burning decks. Commanders issued orders that could no longer be executed. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, had lost the initiative, and he knew it. Yet the battle was not finished. One carrier remained untouched. Hiryu. Within an hour, Hiryu launched a counterstrike. Her aircraft found Yorktown, already damaged from earlier engagements, and delivered crippling blows. For a brief moment, it appeared the Japanese might still claw something back from disaster. But the window had closed. American search planes tracked Hiryu's position. Another strike group was assembled, tired, low on fuel, but determined. The sailor's role in this moment was unremarkable on paper. He did not command the attack. He did not shape strategy. But his aircraft had arrived because of a missed assignment, contributing to the mass of planes that overwhelmed Japanese defenses at exactly the wrong moment. War does not record intent. It records outcomes. As the sun climbed higher and smoke drifted across the ocean, the final act of the battle began to take shape. The destruction was not finished yet. If this breakdown of real World War II events adds value to your understanding of history, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. It directly supports the research behind stories like this. By early afternoon, the Pacific had become a graveyard of smoke and silence. 3 Japanese carriers were already beyond saving. Their crews had abandoned hope of recovery and turned instead to evacuation and scuttling preparations. Destroyers circled, picking survivors from oil-covered water. Only Hiryu remained operational. Her flight deck was scarred but intact. Her air group, reduced but still capable, prepared one final effort. Earlier strikes from Hiryu had inflicted severe damage on Yorktown, knocking her out of action and briefly restoring Japanese morale. But Hiryu was now alone. American reconnaissance aircraft located her position in the early afternoon. The report was passed quickly. There would be no delay this time. Dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown launched once more, flying toward a target they knew would be heavily defended. Fuel margins were razor-thin. Some aircraft would not make it back. As the American planes approached, Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Her remaining fighters climbed to intercept, but they were too few and too late. The dive bombers rolled over. Bombs struck the flight deck, penetrating deep into the ship. Fires erupted almost instantly. Fuel lines ignited. Aircraft parked on deck burned where they stood. Damage control teams fought desperately, but the pattern was already familiar. Within minutes, Hiryu was doomed. By nightfall, the last of Japan's fleet carriers from the operation lay crippled or sinking. The Japanese task force began to withdraw. Admiral Yamamoto ordered the invasion of Midway cancelled. The decisive battle he had sought had turned against him in the most catastrophic way possible. The cost was staggering. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of experienced sailors and aviators, men who could not be replaced. The core of Japan's naval aviation had been destroyed in a single day. American losses were heavy but bearable. One carrier, Yorktown, would later be sunk by submarine attack. Dozens of aircraft and aircrew were lost. But the strategic outcome was unmistakable. The initiative in the Pacific had shifted. For the young sailor, the day ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion and disbelief. There was no sense of personal triumph. He had followed orders, survived where many had not, and landed back aboard a carrier deck marked by damage and loss. He would not fully understand the scale of what had happened until much later. History would not record his lateness. It would not note the misstep or the reassignment. But without that small disruption, the alignment of aircraft over Japanese carriers at 10:20 a.m. might never have occurred in the same way. The battle was over. The consequences were just beginning. If you appreciate historically grounded storytelling that avoids myth and focuses on real moments, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Your support keeps this work alive. What followed reshaped the war, and the men who fought it. The smoke over the Pacific lingered long after the last aircraft had landed. Wreckage drifted across the water, fragments of flight decks, twisted metal, oil slicks stretching for miles. Japanese destroyers continued to recover survivors through the night, pulling men from the sea who had watched their ships burn and sink around them. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the losses were unprecedented. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Over 300 aircraft destroyed. More than 3,000 sailors and aircrew killed, including many of Japan's most experienced pilots and maintenance crews. These were not numbers that could be quickly replaced. Japan's naval aviation training pipeline was long and selective. Experienced carrier pilots represented years of investment. Their loss hollowed out the core of Japan's striking power. Admiral Yamamoto reported the disaster with brutal clarity. The operation had failed. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. Strategic momentum, carefully built since 1941, had been broken in a single day. On the American side, the damage was severe but survivable. Yorktown had absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits. Though she initially remained afloat, she would later be sunk by a Japanese submarine during salvage operations. Nearly 150 American airmen were killed during the battle. Entire torpedo squadrons had been effectively wiped out. Yet the United States could absorb these losses. American industrial capacity was only beginning to surge. New carriers were already under construction. Training programs expanded rapidly. Replacement aircraft rolled off assembly lines in numbers Japan could not match. Psychologically, Midway was transformative. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans could point to a clear, unambiguous victory. It was not defensive. It was not symbolic. It was decisive. News of the battle was tightly controlled at first, but word spread quickly through the fleet. Morale rose. Confidence hardened. The enemy was no longer invincible. For Japanese sailors who survived, the shock ran deeper. The belief in superior doctrine, in decisive battle won through discipline and planning, had been shattered. The loss exposed weaknesses that had been ignored: overconfidence, rigid command structures, and underestimation of American resilience. Amid these vast consequences, the individual stories were nearly lost. The young sailor returned to duty as expected. There were no medals for being late, no recognition for being reassigned. His role, like that of thousands of others, was folded into official reports and operational summaries. But privately, many veterans would later reflect on how narrowly survival and victory had turned. A delayed launch, an altered flight path, an unexpected convergence. The battle's aftermath was not just about ships sunk and lives lost. It was about a war that had changed direction, quietly, irrevocably. And the effects would reach far beyond Midway itself. In the months following Midway, the Pacific War shifted in both scope and mindset. Japan's carrier force had been decimated. 4 of its most experienced fleet carriers, along with seasoned pilots and crew, were gone. Training replacements would take years, time Japan could not afford. The balance of naval power had tilted decisively toward the United States. Strategically, the Japanese offensive was over. Expansion plans stalled. Island fortifications became defensive rather than expansionist. The initiative, once firmly in Japanese hands since Pearl Harbor, now rested with the Americans. For the U.S. Navy, the victory offered more than tactical gains. Confidence surged, morale soared, and naval doctrine was validated. Carrier aviation, previously an unproven concept to many, had demonstrated its decisive role. Future operations would build upon lessons learned that day: coordination, timing, and intelligence-driven targeting. Commanders studied every detail. Admiral Nimitz praised the pilot's courage and ingenuity, but he also noted the role of chance. The accidental convergence of aircraft, including the sailor who had been reassigned, highlighted how small deviations could create outsized results. Historians later emphasized Midway as the turning point in the Pacific. It was not just a battle. It was a pivot in momentum, technology, and human consequence. Without it, the Japanese Navy might have extended its reach into Hawaii or the West Coast. With it, the Americans gained the breathing room needed to industrialize, train, and prepare for offensives across the Pacific. For the individual sailor, the aftermath was quieter. He returned to normal duty, never formally recognized for the accidental role he played. Yet in oral histories and veteran accounts, his story symbolized a broader truth. In war, the impact of a single human being, whether by design or circumstance, can ripple far beyond expectation. Across the Pacific, fleets were rebuilt, strategies were revised, and the war escalated in intensity. But the memory of Midway, a single day when chance, courage, and timing converged, endured. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers and the survival of the American fleet did more than shift military calculations. It reshaped the psychology of both nations, demonstrating that even in the chaos of war, opportunity could arise from unpredictability. War is often measured in grand strategies, fleets, and numbers. Yet sometimes, it turns on a single human presence. A delay, a misstep, an unplanned flight. The young sailor who missed his original assignment did not intend to change history. He did not seek glory. He simply followed orders, adapted to circumstances, and survived. And in doing so, he became part of a chain of events that reshaped the Pacific War. Midway reminds us that human actions, even when seemingly small or accidental, can have extraordinary consequences. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers was not the result of genius or luck alone. It was the intersection of preparation, timing, and circumstance. For history, it demonstrates that victory is never absolute, and defeat is never predetermined. Technology, strategy, and leadership matter, but so do moments of chance, the misalignment of schedules, and the presence of those who are in the right place at the wrong time or the wrong place at the right time. And for humanity, it is a reminder of resilience, of courage, of the ways ordinary individuals find themselves at the center of extraordinary events, without ever realizing the weight of their actions until decades later. The Pacific War would continue for years. Cities burned. Oceans were crossed and lives were lost in unimaginable numbers. But on June 4, 1942, one young sailor, late for duty, became part of a story that demonstrates the delicate balance between intention and impact, and how history is often written by the confluence of both. If this story of chance, courage, and consequence resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your reflections in the comments. Your engagement keeps these rare, real moments of history alive for generations to come.